Hey gang, since our last episode I've taken the opportunity to reread Calypso, and despite my earlier saying that it's an easy chapter, it is still relatively easy compared to especially Proteus, the previous chapter, but it does have some challenges and I was a little surprised. I didn't remember it being quite as many allusions in it. And also I found it a little slow at first, and I think that is largely because Joyce is very aware of the tempo of his chapters and the time of day and where they're taking place. So each chapter is a little differently paced. And this one, set at about 8 in the morning, is going to be pretty slow. Everybody's just kind of waking up and getting their bearings. Our main character, Leopold Bloom, is going to be making breakfast when the chapter opens. And let's take a look at the map and see exactly where we're at. You may recall that the first chapter was way down here, Telemachus on the shore, and then Nestor was a little further inland. And then after that we came a little further north to Proteus, Sandy Mount Strand. But this chapter is going to be north of the main center part of the city. It's still not quite in the center, but it's closer. And the actual address, we know it's 7 Eccles Street. If I recall correctly, the house has actually been replaced now by a hospital or something. Now, since this is the first chapter with Bloom, Joyce is going to make sure that we understand who he is and what kind of a person he is. And the first things that I noticed were, first he's talking to his cat at first, and he's also preparing the breakfast for his wife Molly. And both of these instances show that he's very aware of other people, their perspective. He imagines, for example, the cat, its perspective, what it sees, how it views him. And he's also, when he's making his wife's breakfast, he's very fastidious about getting it right. He wants to do it perfectly. But just notice that his wife is not the one making breakfast, he is, and she's slowly waking up in bed. And this seems like a normal way for them to do things, of him being more subservient to her and him being considerate, but also just being able to see other people's perspective. He just has a really strong imagination. He's always going off on these tangents, and being able just to see the cat at first, for example, is part of that, but we're going to see that much more in the book. I also get the impression right away that Bloom really likes peace, tranquility, comfort. He likes just a comfortable life, and there's also, I notice, a lot of references to light in this chapter. I did a search on an online version, and the word light comes up at least 9 times or so in this chapter. And I think that's, in a way, connected to this biblical vision of light as something that is good, and just in itself, light is good. Now, the general outline of this chapter is pretty simple. Like I said, Bloom's making his wife's breakfast. He goes and checks on her and talks with her a little, and then he does a quick trip to the butcher around the corner, gets some meat, brings it back to the house, picks up the mail, gives his wife her mail and gets his mail, and then he makes the breakfast, and then he has breakfast, and then he goes to the outhouse behind his house. He takes a crap. Yes, you heard me right, and you're going to see that in not super detail, but somewhat detail, probably more than has ever been done in fiction up to that point of this novel. And that's about it. It's a very simple chapter, but there's also some subtext and some things going on that we'll talk about more later. But pretty simple domestic life chapter showing his normal existence. This chapter is also going to show us the method that Joyce is going to use for the remainder of the novel, for the most part, in this stream of consciousness that we saw with Stephen before, but it's a little different with Bloom. We'll look at that a little more closely. But I think perhaps the most interesting part of this chapter that you might miss if you don't, well, not miss, but you don't know exactly what it means, is this reference to Blazes Boylan. It shows up a few times. Molly gets a letter from Blazes Boylan. He's going to show up at the house later in the day around 4 o'clock. And also in the letter from Bloom's daughter, Millie, she mentions Boylan. So this is clearly a figure that we need to know and understand what's going on. And we'll look at that a little more closely in this video. But now you have a general grasp of the basics of this chapter. I think we're ready to go ahead.